Hi guys, in today's episode I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experiences with Sega in the post-Dreamcast years. Now, right after Sega dropped support for the Dreamcast, many games were quickly either canceled directly for the Dreamcast or were ported to other systems. In North America in particular, support for the system was cut within a year basically. There were very few releases, stores were kind of getting rid of their stock. Japan was a little bit of a different story. While the console itself was dropped rather quickly, they still had a few high-profile releases after Sega stopped producing the actual Dreamcast. Within less than a year of that, they still had the next title in the Sakura Taisen series, a couple other Sega exclusives, and some smaller publishers and developers actually still supported the Dreamcast for a good 3 or 4 years after that. And in fact, some of the later Dreamcast releases were well into the PS2's lifespan, and it was a totally different story where the Dreamcast in the beginning was kind of seen as more of a success story in North America than Japan, but it had a longer life in Japan with this sort of very consistent small trickle of releases after Sega dropped the system. It has a much larger library because of that. But over here, some of the major things that were dropped from the console or that were put on other consoles ended up being a really interesting story and kind of formed a little bit how I followed some of that generation. Some of the things that I was looking forward to that were dropped from the console were one was a PC port of Baldur's Gate. And no, it's not something that turned into this, the Dark Alliance games. The actual Baldur's Gate, the original PC and Mac game, was going to be on the Dreamcast. And something similar to that, Black and White from the PC and Mac, was also supposed to be ported to the Dreamcast and was something that was dropped. Now, on the console side of things, there were a bunch of games that either had brief demos shown or lots of official announcements for a Dreamcast exclusive game or a Dreamcast version of a game that was not outright canceled but was just put onto the PS2 or the GameCube or the original Xbox. Now, one of those was Max Payne. Max Payne was originally supposed to be on the Dreamcast, and PC ended up being PC, the original Xbox, and the PS2. Another one was the Dreamcast port of Half-Life, which later turned into this PS2 port, and you can download the ROM, you can find ways to burn the Dreamcast version of Half-Life for your Dreamcast online. You can do that. Dreamcast can run like burn discs and things. It works pretty fine. I haven't had a chance to do that just because I would like to play it on the Dreamcast, but the version that's out there is not as good as this completed PS2 version just because it wasn't 100% finished and there are issues with long load times. Something I want to check out, but just another interesting thing where Dreamcast is supposed to get Half-Life. Another thing was Red Faction was originally supposed to be a Dreamcast game. Now, the continuation of Sega's life into that 6th generation after the Dreamcast had some kind of mixed results depending on what console you look at. The system that kind of got the worst deal overall was the GameCube. The GameCube got some really good ports of some Dreamcast games like Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. They got Skies of Arcadia Legends. They got Evolution Worlds. They got a whole bunch of things, but overall they weren't always the best ports. Part of it, like the Evolution, was Evolution 1 and 2 from the Dreamcast with a lot of cut content shoved onto one game for the GameCube version. And that's kind of what happened with a lot of the GameCube ports of that. They tend to look great visually, the GameCube versions, and sometimes they have complete versions, or even like Sonic Adventure has a little bit of extra stuff. But overall, I think the best example of the GameCube's life as sort of the post-Dreamcast system would be the Skies of Arcadia Legends. It's a give-and-take situation where the Skies of Arcadia Legends has some additional in-game content, and visually it's a little bit better as far as the details, but it actually doesn't look quite as bright and colorful. And you are completely missing out on all the VMU support, of course, and the little mini-game, and it's kind of an interesting extra where the additional content in Legends is great, but not, I don't know, it's kind of a give and take with missing that VMU support. And on top of that, the music takes a huge hit, primarily due to the mini discs for the GameCube, trying to get everything on it was just not quite up to par as far as fitting the whole soundtrack, so you lose a lot of that charm from the original Dreamcast version. And the GameCube really didn't get that many continuations of the Dreamcast library. The two systems that got a lot more were the PS2 and the Xbox. The PS2 was again a bit of a mixed bag though, because some of the ports were terrible. If you look at things like Grandia 2, horrendous. Some of them were only kind of minor ports or straight ports. You had like Dead or Alive 2 Hardcore, which is a slightly improved port. some might say slightly improved port of the Dreamcast version. I actually don't like it as much as the Dreamcast version, but still a good example of a lot of the PS2 stuff where it got ports, but they were either inferior or just on par, and they didn't get a lot of the games that started out as Dreamcast games but were unfinished. They got a lot of ports of finished Dreamcast games. The best system of all time for continuing that life of the Dreamcast a little bit longer in North America in particular, where it didn't get the continued support, was the original Xbox. Now that was partly because Microsoft had a hand, of course, in the actual creation of the original Dreamcast, and they had some experience and some ties with Sega, so they were really in talks to the point where Sega actually for a little while wanted the original Xbox to be able to play Dreamcast games. They really wanted it to be a continuation of that system, and that didn't go through, obviously, but what the Xbox got was a lot of games that had started development or were planned for the Dreamcast eventually became, in those first 2 or 3 years of the Xbox lifespan, an Xbox exclusive. And part of that was also, if you look at the architecture of those three systems, the PS2 and the GameCube and the Xbox, a conversion from a game that was on the Dreamcast just seems to be so much simpler to be able to do for the original Xbox. The Xbox seems so much more capable of bringing those games over complete and in their original form, or even with minor improvements. The PS2, the video quality is not as good as on the Dreamcast, and there are other issues. Of course, the DVD-ROM space versus the GD-ROM, they could definitely do that easily, but overall, the conversion is just not as good, and you see that with a lot of ports. The GameCube, similar issues. Video quality is obviously up there, but there are other issues involved. The Xbox is definitely the system that was most capable of handling those ports from unfinished Dreamcast titles over to the Xbox. And a good example of that, too, is there are actually a handful of games that were announced as Dreamcast games, some that I even have little previews of in some of my Dreamcast magazines, that ended up being Japanese exclusives on the Xbox. Now, worldwide, we also got a ton of great things. Obviously, in North America, one of the biggest releases was Shenmue 2 for the original Xbox, a big continuation over from the Dreamcast for us, since we didn't get the Dreamcast version. Things like Outrun came out on the Dreamcast, Crazy Taxi 3, the Otogi 1 and 2, Myth of Demons, other great games. There's a ton of Sega content in those first 2 years, and a personal favorite of mine, Panzer Dragoon Orta, absolutely loving the series and finally getting into it on the Sega Saturn. And originally Panzer Dragoon Orta was supposed to be obviously the next chapter on the Dreamcast, ended up being a fantastic game on the original Xbox. You have like Gun Valkyrie, all kinds of stuff on the original Xbox. If you are someone who never really got into Microsoft's consoles, I'm particularly not a huge fan of Microsoft or the Xbox consoles. I buy them mostly for really must-have exclusives, or if there's a better version on, say, the Xbox versus the PS2, which occasionally happens. But otherwise, I don't really collect for those systems. The main reason I got the original Xbox, though, was that continuation of the Dreamcast. I had very little interest in the Xbox. Played Halo and a couple other things at some friends' houses, but I went to the store one day and saw Shenmue 2 on the Xbox, and I, at the time, wasn't really into gaming news and never even knew there was a Shenmue 2 since we didn't officially get it in North America on Dreamcast. Ended up buying an Xbox just for Shenmue 2, and then for a while, for actually probably close to a year or more than that, the only games I had for the original Xbox were Sega games that were originally Dreamcast titles. It is the great system where if you're a huge Dreamcast fan, get an original Xbox and check out those games, even some of those Japanese imports I showed you, that were originally supposed to be Dreamcast titles. And that really continued throughout that generation. You have things like House of the Dead 3 on the original Xbox, and a lot of games that would have more than likely been either Dreamcast exclusives, but definitely would have been on the Dreamcast. So that's sort of that arguable territory. You have things like Soul Calibur 2, which might have branched out the way it did and maybe had 4 versions instead of like the 3 with the extra characters. But overall, it seemed like through Sega's dealings with Namco that Soul Calibur might have gone in the direction of being a sort of Dreamcast-only thing. It's very arguable, but no matter what, this definitely would have had, obviously, a Dreamcast version. Another one is Dead or Alive, which Dead or Alive became an Xbox exclusive franchise for a little while there, and it would have been more of a Dreamcast, a Sega exclusive thing, just because of the history of the console and from what the creator has mentioned about the series. The original game was on the Saturn and the PS1, and the Saturn version is the better version, and even the creator himself says that the Saturn version is the preferred version. It is the main version, and the PS2 port of Hardcore may not have happened if the Dreamcast had survived and the Xbox had sort of not come into fruition, because it probably wouldn't have existed, honestly, if the Dreamcast had continued being a huge hit. There's a lot of history there, but overall, Dead or Alive was a series that was moving towards being possibly a Dreamcast exclusive franchise, and even if that had not turned out somehow, it definitely would have been a game on the Dreamcast. Another one would be Grandia 3, which the original Grandia was a Saturn exclusive in Japan, and really the primary reason why it got a PS1 port and was only brought over to North America as the PS1 version, not the Saturn version, was really the Saturn's failure in North America. And in Japan, it was a great game for the Saturn, and it had large enough of an audience that it didn't necessarily need a PS1 port. It may have received that port later to increase sales, but overall, if the Saturn had been as successful in North America as Japan, it probably never would have happened. It probably would have remained Saturn exclusive. Grandia 2 obviously came out on Dreamcast and got a terrible port over to the PS2, and sadly that was actually my first experience with the game, was the PS2 port, not the Dreamcast port, and the differences are extraordinary. They're really surprising. This is something that more than likely, like 90% certain, this would have been a Dreamcast exclusive game had the system continued through that generation. Then of course you have a lot of Sega stuff that very obviously would have been on the Dreamcast. There's even some announcements concerning Virtua Fighter 4 before the end of the system's lifespan, and Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution. Tons of other Sega stuff, obviously, especially some important ones like Phantasy Star. Phantasy Star Online Episodes 1 and 2 was brought over to the Xbox and the GameCube, and eventually the GameCube got Episode 3 Card Revolution, which is kind of an odd game, honestly. I'll talk about that someday. And the PS2 got a lot of continuations with, on the PSP, you got Phantasy Star Portable, and Phantasy Star Portable 2, which I have not checked out yet. I'm thinking I'll probably get the Japanese version. I think it's called Portable 2 Infinity, I think that's what the subtitle is for it, which includes some extra stuff there. And you got Phantasy Star Universe, which was eventually also brought out on the 360, but I think the 360 version never got the expansion set. I'm pretty sure that was only on the PS2. Correct me if I'm wrong below, let me know about that. I'm pretty sure the 360 version only got this, and not the expansion. But again, more Sega stuff that would have continued on the Dreamcast. And my two favorite definitely would have been on the Dreamcast Sega games from that generation, even though the majority of my must-have Sega Dreamcast continuations past its death were on the Xbox. There were a couple on the PS2 that were exclusive and must-have. And obviously, right here, 1 and 2 right here, my favorite Sega games since the fall of the Dreamcast to this day. Sadly, I've not had a chance yet to continue on with the PS3 games. I'm going to do that shortly, because I fell in love with these. I mean, these are some of my favorite games of all time now. Interesting discussion to bring up. I will eventually do a comparison of this series to Shenmue, just because that's brought up a lot, and I want to talk a little bit about why it's an interesting subject. It kind of doesn't make sense, but in a way it makes perfect sense. It's a very odd, complicated thing where they're very comparable series for very different reasons than a lot of people think. But definitely love these two. These are must-have games, even if you have no interest in Sega as a company. I don't care, pick these up. They're great. Perfect examples of amazing storytelling, great visuals, a huge expansive world, a lot of fun, tons of replay value, just wonderful, wonderful games. I'm so glad I finally started getting into this series. So far it's fantastic. The only problem I have with 1 is that this is the first one here they redubbed into English, and the rest of the series just as English subtitles. And for being a game about the Yakuza, being actually about being in Japan. It's an incredibly Japanese thing. It has the same Shenmue thing where it feels so much better in Japanese than it does in English. And the odd thing, though, about the first game is that the dub is not terrible, so you don't really get that cheesy 80s martial arts flick goodness from the English dub of Shenmue 1 and 2. And it's a pretty decent dub. I mean, Kazuma Kiryu is played by Mark Hamill in this one, so it's pretty good. But at the same time, that almost makes it worse in a way. It makes me really want the Japanese dub for this one. I'll have to pick up the Japanese version of this for the PS2. A wonderful series. There was also an HD version of 1 and 2 released on the Wii U and the PS3 in Japan, and we haven't gotten any of those. Sega's been, after this generation, moving into the 7th gen, into the 8th gen, Sega's been really bad. I mean, as a company in general, they've been terrible, but really bad about bringing stuff over to North America from Japan. It's been just terrible. So people are still waiting for Phantasy Star Online 2, and I think that just got an announcement for PS4 actually. I think it was a Vita exclusive for a while, and some people were trying to get on Japanese servers and things like that, and still no announcement for North America. Things like Phantasy Star Nova on the Vita. A lot of the Yakuza games either have not come out here after 4 or only like digital only and things like that, and there's all kinds of stuff with Sega that is very irritating, but in this gen, in the remainder of that 6th gen after the Dreamcast died, there were a ton of fantastic games that came out as being Dreamcast projects that, instead of being completely canceled, even though a lot were from companies outside of Sega, a lot of these Sega internal projects were brought over and continued and spread out amongst these 3 consoles in a really good way, in a way that Sega has kind of failed now, where it doesn't feel like Sega itself just spread to these other consoles. It feels like just this other company with like Sega licenses spurting out crap that is sometimes good, sometimes terrible, and you never know when you go and pick it up. It's kind of almost like Sega's has, to me now, is kind of almost like licensed games from like movies and TV shows, where the majority of the time it's crap, but occasionally there'll be that like hidden gem that's fantastic, like the Yakuza series, but you never know. And the only few exceptions really for me that have come out of Sega have been mostly for the Wii, honestly. Some of them have been on multiple systems, but some of my favorites going into the 7th gen that I've played so far are definitely Sega Superstars Tennis, and I like the Wii version here because I like the option of using the motion controls or the controller. It's a lot of fun, and this is one of the few games, along with Sonic and All-Stars Racing. These two here are sort of the perfect homages to old Sega. They really, in a way, it's a double-edged sword. They're really good games, particularly this one and its sequel, Transformed. Fantastic games that have the old Sega feel. They really make you feel like these are like next-gen Dreamcast games. They're fantastic in that way, and they give you a lot of Sega nostalgia, but at the same time, it makes the other games from Sega that haven't been so good even more disappointing. It makes you really wish for the old Sega. So again, kind of a double-edged sword there. Some continuation of the arcade shooters. Sega's had a lot of great arcade games come out in 7th gen. I mean, that's one thing where they haven't failed entirely. It's not like the golden age of Sega, but they've done a pretty good job still. You know, House of the Dead 2 and 3 Return on the Wii. Really like that version. It's fun to pick up and play. House of the Dead Overkill. Don't like it as much as the old House of the Dead games, but I do love the over-the-top kind of grindhouse humor. It is a lot of fun. It's hilarious. It's something to play with a friend. It's kind of the, as far as arcade shooters go, it's the perfect drinking game. It's absolutely hilarious. You need to play it. Unless you're really, really offended by over-the-top gore and pee jokes and swearing, then stay away from that. But otherwise, it's really, really funny. And another surprise favorite of mine that I remembered playing in the arcade at the beach a lot was Ghost Squad, which is a really, really fun arcade shooter you have to check out. It's honestly one of the best ones that's come out in the entire 7th gen for that really arcade feel. Fantastic game. Another underrated one, too, on the Wii is the Conduit. I haven't checked out the Conduit 2 yet. I've heard some people say it's better, some people say it's worse. I'd love to check it out for myself and see. This is actually a really underrated first-person shooter that I like it because it doesn't try to be that hyper-realistic first-person shooter that's kind of taken over the past couple years, and it doesn't try and be that big, mega, overblown budget, special effect laden, try to be sci-fi epic thing that like Halo's tried to be and different things like that. Instead, it just keeps that sort of fun root of being kind of an arcade-based shooter. It's still a first-person shooter in the vein of something like Halo, but it has more of a classic arcadey type feel with a story that is good but doesn't take itself too seriously. It's just a lot of fun, a great level design, and really good controls. It sounds weird thinking of the Wiimote and the Nunchuck for being controls for first-person shooter, and it takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you do, it's really good, and it's actually the closest you can get to a keyboard and mouse on a console. It really feels kind of like that, and I'm really enjoying it. I wish more games did a good job of doing that on the Wii. Really could have been a good system for first-person shooters instead of something that was kind of overall left in the dust in that genre. That's just a little bit of an overview of a lot of great Sega stuff that came out after the death of the Dreamcast. And again, I said probably the best system to explore that continuation of the Dreamcast life of games that were originally intended for the system would be the original Xbox. After that, the PS2. Then kind of a tie between the GameCube and a lot of the 7th gen consoles. Those are all kind of in a tie. If you're more into the arcades type stuff of Sega, for the 7th gen, actually go with the Wii that has the best selection of that kind of stuff. For a lot of the really big budget exclusives, things like the Yakuza series and things like that, go for the PS3. Sadly, last on that list would be the 360, even though it has a lot of great Sega stuff and that small Dreamcast collection with a couple games, Space Channel 5 and things like that. But overall, I actually do think it's in kind of in third place for that, which is odd considering the original Xbox is the best, but that's just how things have turned out. Sega's now just a very mixed bag, and you never know. You kind of have to cherry pick their games rather than being really excited for everything that comes out. Who knows? Maybe, I don't know, maybe now they're kind of falling apart, but they've also acquired Atlas. Maybe things will turn around a little bit. Obviously, it will never be the same company, but who knows? Maybe Atlas will have a really good effect, and maybe they'll allow Atlas to have access to some of their IPs, like Skies of Arcadia and things like that. You never know. But yeah, that was my experience so far with Sega in the post-Dreamcast years. And I'd love to hear about some of your favorite games and your favorite memories from post-Dreamcast Sega.